Good morning, Reverend Graves.
Morning.
Um, this is Monday, June 16th, 2025, and I am Riley Temple with the African American Episcopal Historical Collection. And this morning we're having a conversation to collect the oral history of the Reverend Charles Graves IV, who is the rector of Christ Church in Shaker Heights, Ohio.
Indeed.
How long have you been there, Reverend Graves?
About 10 months. Not quite, about 9 months.
And
Uh,
how is it so far?
it is wonderful. It's a big transition. I was previously campus minister at the University of Houston. And so I often say in campus ministry, the only space that we had, we didn't own any space, and we only had a rented office that is now just a little larger than my office here. And now I also inherited a 37,000 square foot building in the center of town, and a fairly large congregation, and so there's lots of transition, but the good folks of Shaker Heights have been wonderful, and the city has been very welcoming. So, having survived our first winter up north, at least my first in years, and my husband's first northern winter ever, we're in better shape.
And
If you
where's your husband from?
He's from a small town in South Texas called Palacios, south of Houston, and this is his first time ever living north of Texas, so north of South Texas. So talk about a world of transition to move up to the snowy Northeast, and so it's quite an adjustment, but
Well, he's rather blessed to have you to guide him through it all.
something like that. And so we're making it through. We're making it through.
You
Yes,
know, Shaker Heights is has a reputation
indeed.
for being one of the grand suburbs
Hmm.
in la-di-da suburbs
Indeed.
in America.
Yeah.
Is it still that way?
Yes and no, right? The history is always complicated. The history and the present are always complicated. Um, on one hand, Shaker, as you mentioned, was planned to be at the time that it was sort of founded in the first 3 or 4 decades, was an exclusively white, exclusively wealthy suburb, and then in the 50s went through something of a transformation. 50s and 60s went through something of a remarkable transformation, and after a lot of struggle, especially in the 50s, when the first black families began to move to Shaker, and there was violence, there were threats, and all sorts of things. And then Shaker began to start to embrace it, and actually became one of the first suburbs in America to voluntarily integrate its school system. So there's much to be proud of there. Dr. King
And
once
about what year was this?
this was in the 60s, in the early to mid 60s
Okay.
was when that movement for integration happened. But it was um, and there was a lot of work to voluntarily racially integrate neighborhoods here. The Ludlow neighborhood here was had an incredibly active that actually, when in the era of white flight, when the first black families moved and became rooted in Shaker, they actually had to recruit white families to move into Shaker Heights so that it would not become an entirely black community in order to support racial integration. Uh,
Reverse white flight.
indeed, yeah, and did a lot of work to build community between those white and black families, and so Shaker remains to this day a pretty racially mixed community. I hesitate to say a pretty, I hesitate to say, a truly racially integrated community. We're probably somewhere near 50-50 between black and white in Shaker,
Hmm.
but of course, like most everywhere in the country, tend to have, unfortunately, pretty separate existences, and
Yes.
attendant with all the socioeconomic and other social disparities, that attend everywhere else, around the country and and in much of the world. And at the same time, so it's there's much good and there's much challenge between our Christ Church sits almost on the border, almost on the sort of tri-corner border between Shaker Heights, which I mentioned is racially mixed, Warrensville Heights, which is not quite as well known, but which is about 95% Black, and somewhat socioeconomically a bit lower, and Beechwood, which is predominantly white, and a mix of it's a largely Jewish community, uh,
Hmm.
Jewish and otherwise white community, that is quite a bit wealthier socioeconomically,
Hmm.
and we're kind of in the middle of these realities and sort of finding ways to build relationship and connection and bridge some of those divides. So it's a really interesting place to do ministry.
Okay, I will get to all of this in a little
Yeah.
bit, but I can't resist referring to Martin Luther King's observation
Hmm.
that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours in America. I-
Indeed.
Tell me about Christ Church in that regard.
Yeah, well, so I'm the first Black rector of Christ Church.
Okay.
I think there were three other, to my knowledge, there were three other associate rectors who were Black, starting from the 80s, who served Christ Church. One of them was now the Right Reverend Dion Johnson, who was
Oh,
ordained here.
Missouri.
He preached my celebration of new ministry just a few months ago.
Mhm. We have
And
his oral history.
yes, and Walter Brownridge
Uh-huh.
was also associate. In fact, Walter was the one who encouraged me to apply for rector here last year.
Okay.
Um, and our congregation is about 75 or 80% white, and mostly the remainder are Black, with a small handful of Asian or Latino members as well. And so we are, and of the Black families that we have, many of them live in the surrounding areas, but not many in Shaker. And so we're part of the work that we're trying to do is connect and reconnect with the really substantial Black population here in Shaker, and find out how we can be in better relationship.
Yeah.
Uh, we have a number of other predominantly Black congregations located within Shaker Heights itself. And so we're engaging in deeper relationship with them and with families who are not churched as well, and other organizations and institutions around town. Um, and so we're working. We have work to do, like many other churches do. An interesting note, a historical note, by the way, is that in 1967, I believe, when Dr. King was here, partly to visit Carl Stokes, who was then running for mayor in Cleveland,
Hmm.
he made a stop over in Shaker Heights and spoke just about a mile from here at what was then Heights Christian Church. And the some of the congregants at Heights Christian were unhappy about this and decided to do a long planned renovation, pulling up their pews right at the time that Dr. King was there, such as to prevent him from coming in the church. And so Dr. King spoke from the portico of the church, to a large crowd gathered on the field, and then came right here to Christ Church for a luncheon, on that day. I don't remember the exact day that occurred. But so Dr. King actually did come and visit
I see.
his building, which was newly built at that time. This building was built in 1959 after the previous one had been destroyed in a fire. And so Dr. King came to visit the very building in which I sit. Um,
Now, the Stokes brothers have quite a reputation there. Let's stop for a second and go back.
yeah,
Um, you are Charles Graves the fourth.
I am.
Um, can you tell me about the Graves men, senior, junior,
Sure.
second,
Uh,
or
yeah,
third and fourth?
my father, Charles Graves, was formerly he's a retired city planning director, and was director of the planning department in Baltimore, which is why I grew up in Baltimore. He was
Okay.
there in the 90s and early 2000s. and then served other cities, Atlanta, DC, and was director in Cincinnati for about 10 years until 2017 when he retired. And so I went around the same time that he moved to Cincinnati to take that position. I was graduating from high school. And so I went to spend summers and things with him, and we became members of Christ Church Cathedral in Cincinnati, and that became my sponsoring parish for ordination. And he's now retired and lives in South Florida. As I like to say, as he I sometimes tease him. I said he made the most obvious retirement move and moved to South Florida, but that's all right. He's very happy there. And my grandfather Charles Graves Jr. Was worked much of his career for the Urban League in Gary, Indiana, where
Oh,
my father was raised.
mhm,
And as you know, where they were members of St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, which our family had a major hand in founding.
mhm,
And so he worked with the Urban League. Also was part of a number of marches in that time. Speaking of Dr. King, I understand my grandfather was part of a number of the marches that he did up in the Chicago area when Dr. King came to Chicago to organize.
mhm.
And unfortunately, my grandfather Charles Jr. died at a quite early age in his early 50s from a heart attack, and so his career was cut short in that way. But we certainly come from a very proud legacy of Charles Graveses, so to speak. And
And how far back can you go in terms of years to
yeah,
the earliest graves?
we can. And so as far as the Charles Graves is, my great grandfather Charles Graves Sr., who did much of his work in real estate in the early to mid 20th century. Um, let's see, he died in 1980. I believe he was born in about 1909 or
Hmm.
so.
Hmm.
Although we think that actually it might have been early. There's some question around his correct birth date because it from some documents it appears that he probably lied about his date of birth at some point in order to get into service in the First World War. So actually I think not 1909, 1902 or something like that if I remember correctly. But there's some documentation that claims his birth being a little bit earlier would have been just early enough to be able to serve in the First World War, which is interesting enough.
But
Yeah.
then now, did your family um, was it a participating family in a migration of sorts from the South?
Yes. Yes. So switching over from the Graveses to my paternal grandmother's side. So my father Charles Graves III's mother was Jane Foster Washington Graves, and her mother was Anna Foster Washington, um, and and Anna was married to a man who happened to be named George Washington, and George, interestingly enough, and so George and Anna in the early 1920s moved from Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina area, where they had, from what I understand, were either sharecroppers or tenant farmers. It's
Mhm,
not entirely clear
mhm,
what exactly the arrangement, but they certainly were farm workers there. Moved from there to Gary, Indiana, in the 20s, so that George could find work in the steel and the then burgeoning steel mill industry, and so he came. So that was kind of how they moved up there, and then Charles Graves Jr. and his parents had moved from Oklahoma. My Charles Graves Jr., excuse me, had been born on a then Indian reservation
ah,
in Oklahoma, west of Tulsa.
were they Native Americans?
Partly, yes. There
Yeah.
there were There are some. So I think Charles um, Charles Jr.'s mother was of Indian birth, of Cherokee birth. Part of the Black Cherokee history, which is very interesting on its own.
Mhm.
And so we actually have been able to find her registration in the because she was part of the last generation registered under the Dawes Act, of registered Indians in the language of that time. And so they had come up, and she married a black man, Charles Senior, and they moved up to Gary also for the same reason. So on both sides of my father's history, we've got that northern migration from down south. Yeah.
Now, one of the most interesting um, uh, uh, summaries of Charles Graves the fourth is that you are a seventh generation Episcopalian.
Indeed. Yeah,
Can you talk to us about that a little?
I sure can. So um my uh as I mentioned, my great grandmother, so that is to say, my father's mother's mother, Anna Foster Washington, who, as I mentioned, moved up from South Carolina with her husband. Um, so I'll tell you two parts of the story. As I understand, when they moved to Gary, um, they were already Episcopalian, and so
Out
had
of South Carolina.
out of South Carolina and had wanted to find a church.
Hmm.
There was no at the time, Indiana, Northern Indiana was just frankly just as racist as any part of South Carolina was, uh,
Sure.
and so there was no church that would accept colored membership,
Yeah.
and so they started a house church, and then they eventually were able to secure a building that had been sold by a Catholic monastery that had moved out, and so they were able to secure that building, and so the church was officially founded nearly 100 years ago in 1927, and then moved into another building with some famous architectural history to it. I won't get into all that at the moment, but even before her, so from what I understand, some of my great grandmother's um, grandfather had been born into slavery, and at least and she wrote down some of this history. He had, as we understand, learned to play the organ. We don't know how. We don't know how or to the extent that he was able to become literate in that time. Of course, an extraordinary accomplishment then. Uh,
Yes.
but that but that he played music at the local Episcopal Church there in Spartanburg, and so we have some of that, and you can still see, and this is the Foster family. You can still go back and see the Foster plantation in it's either in Greenville or Spartanburg, I forget which, but you can still see the Foster plantation there to this day, and so we can trace our history all the way back.
You should know that in the African American Episcopal Historical Collection um, is a sizable history of Black Episcopalians from South Carolina,
Hmm.
and which is fascinating to me. That almost, it's not something that we've planned. Almost um, over the transom, the stories and legacies of the Episcopal Church in South Carolina makes itself known.
Hmm.
Um, Now, what about clergy?
No, I'm the first clergy person in the family. I sometimes wonder if I sometimes imagine that my great grandmother probably would have become a priest if it had been possible for her to do so in that time.
Mhm. Now,
Um,
why do you say that?
Oh, I mean, in the way that she was not just a founderess of her church, and kind of it was. I'm told it was always the running joke that the priests do what they might, but Mrs. Washington was really in charge. But I mean, as it was in those times that even while barred from the priesthood and from ordained ministry, that women still found ways of exercising an extraordinary amount of power and influence in their congregations. But I've read some of her writings and some of her letters, and just the way that she writes of her faith. One can tell that there's extraordinary spiritual development there, and that she knew she was doing ministry in every sense
Mhm.
of that word. And so, but no,
Now,
I'm wanted to actually wear a collar.
when did you call what town did you call home? Gary?
No, I never grew up. My
You
much
said
of my
Baltimore.
history in Gary, but I grew up in Baltimore. I was born in Washington D.C., but my parents lived in Rockville, Maryland at the time, just
I
over
see.
the border. And so we lived briefly in Appleton, Wisconsin. My father was director of the planning department in Appleton for about a year and a half or 2 years, and then we moved back to Maryland when he became director in Baltimore. So I was raised in Baltimore, and as well, you can't quite see from where you're sitting, but behind my desk over here, just past the dog stuff, are a few pictures of myself with presiding Bishop Curry, as I've mentioned. Bishop Curry,
Were you a member of St. James?
yes, we were members of St. James. Bishop Curry was my childhood rector.
Hmm.
So when as the story goes, that when we were getting ready to move back from Wisconsin back to Baltimore, or back to Maryland to move to Baltimore, my father ran into someone in the airport who he hadn't met, struck up a conversation, and it turned out the gentleman was a member of St. James, or that he was an Episcopalian. I don't know how that came up in the conversation, but my father did what he still does often, which is to ask for a church recommendation. And the gentleman said, "Oh, you ought to check out St. James Lafayette Square. They have this really interesting, young rector, young preacher, Michael Curry. You ought to hear him." And so
From
we
Winston-Salem.
indeed, yeah, yeah, we came to St. James, and he had, of course, previously served just before that or just outside of Cincinnati in Lincoln Heights.
Yeah, yeah.
He had become rector in 1988. We joined in 93, and so I was 3 years old, and it was just after the Great Fire of 1993. St. James was struck by lightning, and much of the interior of the church was destroyed, and so the congregation was worshiping in the fellowship hall for the first year or so of our membership at St. James, and then after the repairs were sufficient, we're able to move back into the congregation, into the sanctuary. And so I grew up as an acolyte under then Father Curry. His two daughters, Elizabeth and Rachel, are very close to my age. And so, in fact, one a little old, Rachel a little older than I am, and Elizabeth a little younger. So we all grew up in Sunday school together and have been friends. I'm still
Okay,
friends.
I have to I have to ask you a question.
Yeah. Oh yeah, anything.
When I was taking presiding Bishop Curry's oral history, which was just weeks before the end of his term,
Right.
and we were talking about his daughter's
Hmm.
colleges, and he could remember that one of them, I think, um, did go to Hobart and William Smith, or did he? He did.
He went to Hobart. Yeah.
Right. And where did the other two go? Because he couldn't remember. He said after all that money that he spent.
I believe Elizabeth went to UNC.
Okay.
She went to UNC. And I don't know that Rachel went to college. I don't know that Rachel graduated from college. I may not remember that, but I know Elizabeth. At least I believe Elizabeth went to UNC, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
But
Now,
I went to Hampton. My father went
well,
to
I want
Hampton.
to get to that. I need to get to that. Um, some when I became a lawyer, um, early on in my career as a lawyer, I spent some time as a counsel in the United States Senate.
Mm,
And one of the people who served on the Judiciary Committee with whom I worked very closely was Mac Mathias,
mm,
former senator, liberal Republican from Maryland.
right.
Um, I grew up in Richmond, and every summer, my family, my brother, my mother, and father, and I would repair to a home that we rented in Phoebus and would go to the segregated beach,
Mm,
which was Bay Shore, which was a place for summer employment for many students at Hampton.
mhm.
Why
Yeah.
did you decide to go to Hampton?
My father, like I said, my father went to Hampton and he studied political science. And in fact, when I became a student, it turned out that he and I actually had some of the same professors who had been there teaching for, over 30 years and had seen two generations of students. So that was part of it. I remember as a child going with my father to Hampton homecomings and, all that sort of thing. But I was resolved for a long time in high school that I was not going to go to Hampton, sort of, being a teenager and not wanting to follow the same path as your parents, right? But what I knew, um, for middle and high school, I went to Friends School of Baltimore, a quite elite private school, a Quaker school, and a school that was about 90% white.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and so I grew up in a church family that was very black
Yeah.
and very, very black, very urban, and very inner city, and a school at the same time that was very white, although it's in the city lines, very suburban in character.
Hmm.
Uh, and so kind of opposite experiences. And but even so, I mean, of course, I was at school 5 days a week and at church only one day a week for the most part. And so I didn't necessarily have the feeling or the sense of community, of Black community, especially of Black sort of kids, young people, youth my same age, some in church, but not as much, in a kind of encompassing social environment. And I felt that need. I knew that I wanted to study political science, and I knew that, and I had a sense from early on that I wanted to go to an HBCU, and so Hampton rather naturally found itself on the list,
As
and
opposed to Morehouse.
as opposed, although I visited Morehouse and I'd visited Howard, and a handful of others. My grandfather, Charles Jr., had gone to what was then North Carolina College for Negroes,
Oh,
now
yeah. Yeah.
Central, and I looked there. I looked my grandmother and great grandmother, Jane Graves Hill and Anna Washington, had both gone to St. Augustine's College, and so I looked at St. Augustine's, and um, and Hampton. Frankly, I got a scholarship from Hampton at the right time. I got a full tuition scholarship from Hampton, and the check boxes kind of all came into place. I'd done a summer pre-college program at Hampton,
Hmm.
and so when I got the early admission letter from them, that answer was, that was pretty much resolved. So that
Now, did you like Hampton?
It's a complicated question, to be
Why?
honest with you. I was glad to have gone I'm glad to have gone to an HBCU. I did get, in a lot of senses, what I thought that I was looking for, which I think has been a real benefit in my life, which is that connection with the Black community, kind of the opportunity to sort of understand myself as being what I would say meaningfully Black, more than just kind of happening to have been born Black, but feeling like I was born Black on purpose.
Hmm.
And, that God was doing something on purpose. When God made me a Black person, right? And and at the same time, and I have incredible friends from Hampton, like many people when they go to college, some of the, greatest, most enduring lifelong friendships.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm getting ready to celebrate a wedding here. I just had the consultation with the couple yesterday. that are going to get married here at Christ Church next month. And the groom is a dear friend of mine from Hampton.
Ah,
So those relationships do endure. The challenge was that so in high school, I felt sort of alienated as a Black person, but very connected as a gay person. I came
yeah.
out in high school, was blessed with a great church family, St. James, wonderful parents who were very affirming and accepting, teachers who were affirming and accepting. So I didn't have that struggle in high school. But in college, it sort of flipped because I was Black like everybody else in a sense, but as a gay person at the time, Hampton just was not. This is from 2008 to 2011. I referred to this in my sermon at the National Cathedral. At the time, Hampton was just not a place that frankly was a safe or affirming space for LGBTQ folks, and so many
Did
of
you
us.
feel unsafe?
I was certainly closeted except for to a few friends. And yeah, I would say I did not feel safe as a gay person to be there. I did not feel it was a safe place to be out.
Well,
Yeah.
can we go back a little bit
Yeah.
and talk about your sexuality?
Sure. Yeah. Ask me anything.
When did you first know
Yeah.
that you were a homosexual?
Um, I guess I started it I I don't know. Middle school is sort of the first, like a lot of kids, the first crush, that I remember having on anybody was in middle school, with another guy in my class. Uh,
Hmm.
nothing ever came of it, but it was the first that I, was sort of aware, that I had interest in another guy in that way.
And
Um,
did you have a reputation?
no, I don't think so.
Okay.
And I was never a particularly flamboyant, personality or anything like that. And fortunately, like I said, I was in a school that was it was a very affirming school, even
Yeah.
even at that point. Um, and so, but I didn't really think much of it. I never, I often say I'm not one of those people who, from the time they were 3 years old knew that they were different in some way or, whatever it is. And so, I try to kind of, just maintain a sort of open spirit about it. And I didn't, thankfully, because I had, affirming parents and teachers and all that, I didn't feel like the kind of, pressure or worry about, oh my God, am I different and, all that kind of thing. So I was able to just kind of go about my life in a sense. And then in high school, I think it was, and my school had a GSA, a Gay Straight Alliance, and so which was a great place for kids, especially as many of us were kind of, coming into our own and trying to and sort of discovering, who we ourselves were and all, different manners of that. I remember being part of the GSA, you know, without even really thinking about, am I queer, am I gay, am I, whatever. I was, being a part of a club with other kids you know, who who were friends, who were friends of mine. And I, through that at some point in there, I started to, to kind of see myself as a gay person.
Hmm.
Uh, I can't point to an exact moment or,
Yeah.
day when, the light clicked on and, oh my God, I'm a gay person. But I do remember I remember, telling my friends and uh they were like, yeah, duh, we knew that. What's the big deal? Which is probably the best reaction that one could ask for.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then I told my parents in turn, and they were both fine about it. It took them a little while to kind of settle into it, but they were both,
Do you
understanding.
think they knew before you told them?
Probably,
Yeah.
but they were good enough not to say so.
Well, so when you went to Hampton, what year did you start Hampton?
2008.
2008.
Yeah.
You
The
were out in 2008.
Not really. I mean, I had the odd experience that I was out and kind of went back in and then came out again.
I
Uh,
understand that.
so like I said, I'd been out in high school and all of that. I
Mhm.
knew I'd been told that Hampton, of course, it's a Christian school, is a bit more conservative, in a social sense, and from the kind of old, Southern Black church kind of tradition, and so I remember this. I'll never forget this. The first, so at Hampton, I don't know if it's this way still, but in your freshman year, the first Sunday of your freshman year, which is right at the end of orientation, right at the end of freshman orientation right before classes start, all freshmen are required, or at least then were required to go to the university chapel for that first Sunday. Right. And I went to the university chapel, like all good kids. And that Sunday was the first time I had ever heard homophobic remarks from the pulpit.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness.
and I won't go into what all the chaplain said, but it was the first time. I mean, it kind of struck me in that way, and I remember being so shocked by it because at St. James, of course, I never heard Bishop Curry say a
No,
homophobic thing.
no.
We never had we
Did you
didn't.
ever confront the chaplain?
Um, Only later, only a couple of years later, I'd been invited. So in 2010, I think, I'd been in my last year because I finished Hampton in 3 years.
Yeah,
I sped up my process, frankly, to graduate and to to get the degree and get out.
yeah.
And so in my
You
last
see
year,
that as an escape?
yeah, I knew that I could do one of three things,
Yeah.
basically. And my mother's a college counselor, academic counselor.
Mhm.
So she and I worked through my academic calendar in extraordinary detail, planned it out from the beginning, my entire course load for the rest of my college career. And I decided to take an extra class each semester and an extra class each summer to try and finish a year
Yeah,
early. I
yeah.
knew I could do one of three things. I could either, um, uh, well, I could pledge and graduate on time. I could pledge a fraternity and graduate on time. I could study abroad and graduate on time, or I could do neither of those things and graduate early. And I chose to do neither of those things, kind of speed up my track and graduate early. Um, and I made that decision. I didn't when I decided that in my freshman year. Um, I didn't have the conversation with my parents that I'm doing this because I'm gay and I want to graduate and get out. But I think, you know, I knew that that was the case. I knew that that was true. And
Yeah.
it was a motivator for me, all along. Yeah,
And you obviously did well at Hampton.
I did. Yeah, I graduated magna cum laude.
Okay. Were you Phi Beta Kappa?
No, only because I didn't want to be. I chose not to do the academic fraternity, the academic
Did you
sections.
did well at Hampton? I assume that you enjoyed the academic experience.
I did enjoy the academic experience. I loved being a political science major. Um, had great friends through the political science program.
Uh-huh.
Was a part of the Dr. William R. Harvey Leadership Institute,
Oh yeah,
graduated with a minor in leadership,
yeah.
and
I remember Dr.
that,
Harvey.
that experience is. I'm very glad to have done that, and it was able to work in politics right out of college.
What do you mean by that?
So my first I graduated in May of 2011, and my first job starting immediately after was that I was hired as the campaign manager for then city council candidate Brandon Scott, who was running his first campaign for city council.
Hmm.
And of course he was elected to city council, he was elected later to two terms on council, and then as city council president, and now as mayor of Baltimore. So he and I are not in close touch anymore, but I was able to kind of work with him at the beginning of his career, which was exciting. And then speaking of the Senate, because of my connection to Ohio, uh,
Hmm.
I interned for Sherrod Brown in his DC office toward
Wonderful
the end of
guy.
his first term. Yeah, just as he was getting ready for his 2012 reelection campaign,
Yeah.
and worked for another candidate for Congress in in the Cincinnati area in 2012. That was not a successful campaign, but you
Ooh.
win, you lose some. A guy named Dave Krikorian who ran for the second district. Yeah, you wouldn't have known him. It was a sort of
Armenian.
it was a one-shot primary campaign,
Okay.
narrowly lost. And he did not stay in politics after that, a local businessman.
Are you still involved in electoral politics at all?
No, I'm still involved in politics, in the ministry sense, in the advocacy kind of sense. And I follow politics,
Good.
all the political reports and could tell you things about elections all across the country, in probably
Yeah.
excruciating
You're a
detail.
junkie.
Definitely a junkie and armchair,
Yeah.
armchair, whatever. But yeah, don't and I mean, there was a time up until up until seminary, I really thought that I was going to run for office. I saw myself much more as a future politician than as a future priest.
Reverend
And
Graves,
yeah, yeah,
your life isn't over.
yeah, that's true.
Okay. Now, let me, because you came along during the era of Barack Obama.
I did. Yeah.
I can't tell you how envious I am that you came into your maturity,
Mhm.
seeing and having the experience of a black president and the black family in residence at the White House.
Mhm.
Now, when did you first know that when did you first feel that you were had a call to the ministry?
Mm. Um, we've got to go back pretty far. So, I mean, going back to St. James and my involvement in church. So like I said, I grew up starting to acolyte under Bishop Curry.
Uh-huh.
He left to become Bishop of North Carolina when I was 10 years old.
Uh-huh.
And so under his successor, Alan Robinson, I got much more active, as I got a little older. So at 13, my parents sort of made me join the youth group. By 14, I had been elected the youth president of the St. James Youth Group. And then a year later, and what I didn't know, what nobody told me was that it was then the tradition that whoever was the president of the youth group also became the rector's youth appointee to the vestry. And so I served on my first vestry at 14.
Oh,
And
you poor thing.
I know, well, sometimes I say that after serving as a vestry on that young age, it's lucky I'm still a Christian. But anyway, and then a year later, I caught the attention of then Bishop Eloff, Bob Eloff,
Uh-huh.
and he appointed me to the Diocesan Executive Council as the youth representative. And so I was on Diocesan Council at that from the age of 15 to 18. I was very involved in church, from a very
So you had a wonderful, rich Episcopal ancestry.
absolutely, yeah.
And then because of your activities in the church, you then wind up with the imprimatur of the church establishment.
Yeah, yeah. And so from from my teenage, years, folks in the congregation would affectionately, say, "Hey, Reverend," tell me I was, going to be a priest and uh uh all that sort of thing. And so I,
And how did you feel?
um dubious at best.
Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I at the time I saw myself, I saw my future in politics. I mean, there were, sheets of paper and things where I'd written out, this is the year that I'm gonna run for, state representative. This is the year that I'm gonna run for Congress. This year, run for governor or whatever. Um, and so, I mean, that was kind of where I saw myself. I didn't, I thought that really I would be a theologically that I would be a church involved layperson. I knew
Mm.
that church would always be a major part of my life, and that politics would be or government would be a major part of my life. And so I kind of took it, when folks would say, "Hey, Reverend," I would take it as sort of affectionate teasing, but didn't or kind of I don't know, with appreciation, but didn't take it too seriously. And so after Hampton and after working on campaigns, I applied. I I thought that I wanted to do a dual divinity law program, an MDiv JD program. So I applied to a couple of schools that had them. Hampton,
Like
not Hampton, sorry.
where?
In addition to Yale, I applied to Wake Forest,
Okay.
to Vanderbilt, to Emory. Uh,
Sewanee?
didn't apply to Sewanee because I don't know. Does Sewanee have law school? I don't know. I didn't apply to Sewanee. Uh,
Okay.
no, because Yale is the only Episcopal, Berkeley Yale has
Yeah.
or is the only school in the country that has both an Episcopal seminary and a law school. So Sewanee
Yes.
not a law program, and or at least not a dual program. And so I didn't consider Sewanee, but I got a full scholarship to Yale, a full tuition scholarship, and so that sort of made the decision. And so I
Well, it was
started.
also Yale.
It was all, yeah,
Now, when did you, you said there was you had a dubious
yeah, react.
internal notion that this was to be your call in life. But when did you feel that you were being formed?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it was. So um, I participated in a sort of discernment at the time. The Diocese of Maryland had a what they were calling a young adult discernment group. They
Yeah.
had seven or eight young adults, all in our early 20s, who were all interested in pursuing discernment for the priesthood or for ordained ministry potentially. Uh,
Hmm.
and so I'd been a part of that group, and they were in transition of bishops, and that process didn't sort of. There were a lot of challenges with it, and the response I got was you may be called to ministry, but if so, not yet. Go and do some. At the time what they were saying to a lot of young adults, which was, go and do something else, get some career experience, and then, come back when you've, grown up a little bit. So to
Hmm.
be
Hmm.
blunt, they were more pastoral about it than that. But
Yeah.
so that was the response that I got, and so I went off. So listen, my thought was to do, to go and maybe do law school and maybe practice law or something like that. But
Hmm.
um, and so but I still wanted to have the theological background. So I applied um, to the dual MDiv JD program. And at Yale, the way that you do it is that you do if you're in that program, you do a year of divinity and then a year of law and back and forth. And so I thought that if I applied to the divinity school first, and you apply separately. So I figured if I applied to the divinity school first, in the first year, then in the second year, being already a Yale student, I would probably have a better chance, frankly, of being admitted to the law program. And so I did a year in the divinity school, and you're able to audit classes. So um, uh, if you're at Yale in one graduate level program, you can audit a class in any other graduate school at the university. And so in my first year, I audited two law classes.
Which two?
Uh, I think I did a con law class. I think I did a constitutional law. I don't even remember, to be honest with you. But
I think I
I
would have advised you to take the basic entry
yeah,
courses. Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure. Anyway, what I remember taking away from the experience, the point of it though is what I remember taking away is feeling so because I was in my seminary life surrounded by other students who were discerning their calls or who had just been accepted as postulants and all that. Talking about how they experience their calls to ministry. I just felt such resonance with that. And the more and more I sort of thought and prayed about it, I realized that, I'd been thinking about law because I wanted to be involved in politics, not because I actually
Yeah.
wanted to practice law. I
Yeah.
never,
Yeah. Yeah.
I never felt any call to practice law. Uh,
Hmm.
and so, I kind of said, well, even if I do run for office, I don't need to be a lawyer for that.
That
Uh,
is admirable.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and I kind of discerned out of studying law and went on to finish with the seminary program. Yeah, with the MDiv. And then later I had to kind of back engineer myself into the ordination process because of course that's not the way that you're supposed to do things. But I did and was accepted in but at that time I had moved from by that time I had moved from Diocese of Maryland to the Diocese of Southern Ohio. So I was able to pursue the process through that
I
diocese.
see. I see. Did you find that I guess you found that to be a more hospitable place. What um is that the correct assumption?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um
Hold that thought for just a moment while I get something to drink. Okay, all good.
of course when I hear about law and Yale and Berkeley, I think of Pauli Murray.
Mm,
We have
yeah,
some of her papers, by the way.
yeah.
Um, when, what was your, how do I want to ask this? Can you spend a moment or two of this is not too personal,
Ask me anything you want. Yeah.
uh, sharing the nature of your relationship with God
Hmm.
and its evolution
Hmm. Wow.
during that period of time?
Yeah. I think I,
In other words, did you have a prayer life?
yeah,
Okay.
did. I did. In many ways, I'm probably odd among my generation and a lot of others in that I never experienced you know, I think we're so accustomed in the church to this narrative of, young people, they grow up in the church, they go to college, they leave the church, eventually they come back 15 or 20 or 25 years later when they've got their own kids and, want to have their kids grow up in church, right?
Mhm.
I never experienced that.
Mhm.
I remember I remember praying through high school. I remember praying through college. I mean, especially as I was kind of navigating all the issues around knowing that I was gay through the experience at Hampton. That I said being kind of an inhospitable experience in that way. I remember praying
What were you
very
praying for?
fervently, very fervently through that.
Were you praying for deliverance?
No, no. I've never ever wanted to not be gay. Um, no, praying for guidance to navigate through the challenge of making it at Hampton, of navigating through this period of time. I knew that it would, be a limited period of time that I would be, in the closet at this university. But it was, like anybody who's ever been in the closet, it was a very difficult experience
Yeah, yeah.
to not be able to be who I was. I have to kind of stifle so much of myself. And so I remember praying really, really fervent. And I'm not one who weeps very often. In fact, I'm one who weeps very, very rarely. And as I mentioned in my National Cathedral sermon, I remember like really praying tearfully at night, for just guidance to try to figure out how to navigate through. And so my relationship with God was always strong, and my relationship to the church, for that matter. I mean, I have I have never not been an active Episcopalian. I was active in church. I founded church in college that I was active, in, all through that time. And so and in seminary it was interesting. I remember making the assumption going in that, oh, I'll be spending my life, focusing on God, focusing on
Yeah.
my faith. I'll have all the time in the world to, to pray and to study scripture and all of that. Of course I didn't know and didn't realize until like, studying scripture to have to write a paper on it and, praying and praying because you're required to be at the university chapel is a very different thing than, nurturing your spiritual life in that way, right? And so I had to learn to do that. It did not come naturally. And so there was some time during seminary when I felt fairly distant from God because I was um I was focused on my faith in such an academic in such a literally
Yeah,
academic way.
I understand.
Yeah, that it was hard to find the spiritual connection again. And so I had to learn how to balance that, and of course, as so many clergy and folks who are and lay people who are involved in religious ministry will tell you, doing, doing church for work is not the same thing as doing church for,
So,
for your soul. Yeah, yeah.
what was that a new that distance?
Yeah.
Um, you use distance.
Yeah.
You wouldn't go so far as to say it was alienation.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
so was that the first time you had felt that distance?
Mm, I mean, it comes and goes, right? I mean, well, I can't speak for everyone. I can speak for myself. It was probably one of the more long-term periods of that distance that I felt. There were certainly times at Hampton as I was like I said, navigating through kind of, being closeted and all of that, that I sort of, it was harder to find that connection because I hadn't, been through those sort of difficult experiences. But, there would be times when um, you know, times when I would, have these deep, fervent, very emotional prayers, and then I would be, incredibly stoic for, for weeks, and so on and so forth. When I didn't feel that same, I don't know, emotional connection, with God, and so, it kind of came and went. But I think in seminary there was some, again, I would experience some deep moments of connection from time to time, but yeah, it was one of the more challenging experiences of my spiritual life, especially in that, one of the things, of course, about seminary is that, I sometimes say that in other graduate studies, say if you're studying, I don't know, engineering or, or law or whatever else, that can be challenging in an emotional, a physical way, sometimes in a spiritual way. But what you're learning about engineering or math or law may or may not challenge, the most deeply held aspects of your life, especially if religion and faith are, that, deeply held part of your life. Where if you're studying theology, then not only what you learn that kind of challenges what, you were always taught in Sunday school or whatever else, not only does that challenge you academically, it also can really shake your faith because, if you thought,
That's what I want to ask about. Yeah, but shaking your faith sounds
yeah.
like a state of crisis to me. Um, did you ever have that sense that your relationship with God was somehow in a state of crisis?
Um, yeah,
Okay.
and vocate part of it being vocational crisis,
Yeah.
Uh, like I said, I thought that, God had called me into political, into
Yeah.
politics. That was kind of a big part of that was sort of the center of my personality. And then it was like, whoa, wait a minute, God, what is this, even despite the fact that I was in seminary, for goodness sakes, whoa, you want me to be a priest? What? And so that kind of shaking and also, I mean, I had never, of course, like I didn't do any academic work in religion in seminary, and so, I started a master's program at Yale in theology after having never studied religion or theology more at a higher level than Sunday school before, right? And sometimes I say it's like, it'd be like starting at Yale or Harvard Med School and the only other, but you never got, but the highest level of science that you got before that was in middle school, like that wouldn't happen, but it happens in
Yeah.
seminary,
Yeah. Now, did in the course of this of exploring or experiencing that relationship with God, I sometimes speak with um, gay and lesbian, bisexual um, people who are people of faith,
Mhm.
who at some point question God's love
Hmm.
of them.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think I ever had that.
Ah,
Um, I mean, even in the hardest, even those days in high school and in college, when, I mean, I don't talk about it a lot, but I mean, when I would go to bed crying at night,
oh,
it was never questioning whether God loved me. Never. It was questioning how God was going to lead me through that period.
what were you crying about?
Man, it was hard. It was, I mean,
What was hard?
um, I every especially in college, so much about myself had to I mean I had to kind of have a whole separate external self. I mean I everything from, I mean, as I navigated life, had having to, think about, in a way that I never had to before about, how to walk, how to talk,
Yeah,
how to socialize, how to
yeah.
talk, how to, try to be social, with how to be social with other guys in a socially appropriate, expected way and not let on. How to be social with girls in a way that didn't let on. How to be, like how to sit and not cross my legs. Like the whole, everything.
Oh,
Um, and that and so I never. I mean, I had very little in the way of a social life in college,
yeah.
uh, because I I didn't know how to have a social life and and be able to sort of function in society with being anything like myself, because anytime I was ever in a social setting, I was so much in my head trying to figure out how I'm supposed to act, that I could never just sort of let my guard, or I could very rare, the only time I ever could really let my guard down was around the, handful, five or six friends that I could really be myself with. And that was, it was, needless to say, not all the time. And that was, so I'd never, um, I don't know that I felt alienated from God in that time, but I certainly felt alienated from society in that
Hmm.
way. And yeah, I mean, and I prayed a lot of, I prayed a lot of hard prayers in that time,
And was that a refuge for you?
I mean, yeah, you mean
A
being
rock that cleft for you?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I was grateful to have spaces to be able to get away, when I was back, when I was because I would go when I was at Hampton, I would go back to Cincinnati to be with my dad, and I had a number of friends in Cincinnati at that time,
Hmm.
who I was out to, and who I could be myself with, and kind of being away from the college setting, I could be more myself. And so so I had that escape, that kind of escape, and likewise had I had places to get away, and thank God for that, because I can't imagine, I mean, I feel so much for so many, queer, kids, LGBTQ kids who have no escape,
Yeah,
where to go, and don't know that there even is such a thing as an escape, which unfortunately I think is, where you get so much, suicidality in the LGBTQ
yeah.
community. Um,
Did you ever feel that kind of risk?
no, no, I did. I mean, and thank God, because I had enough people in my life, supportive adults and friends and all of that I could go to. I never felt that. But it was more, it was always um, I mean, even kind of during those hard, years in college, it was like and that was, like I said, why I sped up my academic track to, like, all right, this, I got to get through these couple of years, and then,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I'll be able to get out on the other side. Yeah.
And I assume that that fueled your desire to get through as quickly as possible. You, yeah, you spoke about that experience in contrast
Hmm.
to what you experienced in high school,
Yeah. Yeah.
being out and then having to go back in a way.
Hmm.
What happened after that when you got to Yale?
First thing, I was able to come out again. I mean, I promised myself, I swore to myself and to God at some point in college that once I graduated, that I would never ever allow myself to be closeted again, to go through that again. And so like right after I graduated, as soon as I graduated, um, you know, I I didn't have, you know, kind of being clear with myself that I was not going to be closeted again
Mhm.
was kind of gave myself permission to, to kind of self-disclose in, to people that I thought, that I wanted to know. Um, I at some point, I heard it described when I in college ministry. I remember talking to somebody at Texas Southern who said that for some it's a coming out, and for some it's an inviting in. There's not, you don't you don't need a coming out party or something, but you just you have the opportunity to kind of to tell people in a way that feels normal and natural, and and not feel like it has to be an event, and that was sort of how I was, and I kind of just allowed that pressure to release. um and so I kind of went on with my went on with my life. And so when I worked in politics, I was never shy about like I even when as it came up naturally in conversation, I would mention it or whatever, but never kind of made a big deal of it, so to speak. And likewise in seminary, thankfully, of course, Yale Divinity or Yale's a obviously a very progressive place, and so
Yeah.
I was able to kind of be who I was, and it was never a big deal, so to speak. Yeah.
Where did you go? I'm sorry, I'm going to rush
Oh, you're good. You're
so
good.
long here. When what was your first placement right out of Yale?
My so because my ordination process was a bit strange, like I said, because of kind of how I came into the process. I didn't start my ordination process until midway through seminary. Um,
Hmm.
so as a result, I had basically 2 years after graduating seminary before I could be ordained. Because I didn't become a postulant until the winter of my senior year. And so I for the first year after, so I graduated in May of 2015, and then that September, I was the so I spent a year as the young adult service corps intern at in Rome at St. Paul's within the walls Episcopal Church in Rome. So I lived in Italy for a year. Absolutely loved it. Worked with
I am pea green with envy.
uh, it's a great place.
Was Austin Rios there at the time?
Austin was there. Yeah, I worked for Austin. I adore Austin. He's wonderful. He's still a dear
You know, we
friend.
tried to call him, some of us tried to call him to St. John's Lafayette Square in Washington,
Yeah,
which is my
yeah,
parish. Yeah,
yeah. He would have been wonderful there. And the
he
Diocese
would have
of
been.
California is a lucky place. Um, and frankly, when he before okay, well, when he left St. Paul's within the walls to become bishop, man, I wanted that brother's job real bad before I got called to Christ Church. And God had other plans.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it was a wonderful place, and so I got to work with Austin and with the refugee community there, and with the Latino immigrant community there, and just wonderful, wonderful experience. My Spanish is better than my Italian now because I use the Spanish a little bit more frequently than the Italian, but I got to learn to be at least conversant in both, and so I did
I
that.
have no sympathy for you, by the way.
I know, I know. Well, and then after that, I spent a year in the Episcopal Service Corps, excuse me.
Uh-huh.
So my bishop had told me that Bishop Bridenthal in Southern Ohio told me that though I had a second year, that if I spent a second year in Rome, that it would postpone my ordination by another year, and I didn't want to postpone my ordination any further, and so I came back and did the Episcopal Service Corps program in Cincinnati. Um, and Bishop Bridenthal was probably right because I think he didn't want to lose me to Italy. I think he knew that if I spent another year there, I probably would still live in Italy now.
Yeah, you would have been an expat.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, frankly, especially these days, I wish I could do that one over. But no, I'm teasing. But yeah, I would. So anyway, I came back to Cincinnati, spent a year actually working at Christ Church Cathedral, Cincinnati, in some of their outreach programs. Worked with the homeless community and the immigrant community on the west side of Cincinnati
Yeah.
as a tutor for an immigrant nonprofit there. Um, and uh, and so I did that from 2015 to six. No, I was in Rome from 2015 to 16, and then in Cincinnati with the Service Corps from 2016 to 17, and then was ordained a deacon in June of 2017, and I served as a curate at Church of the Advent in Cincinnati for 2 years from 17 to 19. Yeah.
And that was your first assignment in real parish ministry, correct?
My first assignment in parish ministry and my first assignment as an ordained clergy person. Yeah.
Okay. And did you you obviously, well, obviously, I assume that you found parish ministry to be rewarding.
Sometimes. No, what's kind of funny is so I mean, Church of the Advent was then I mean, it's still not a very big church, but it was then pretty small, maybe 35 on a Sunday or so. And I worked with a great priest and who's still a dear friend, Reverend Stacy Salas, who's from Michigan and she's now returned to Michigan.
Mhm.
And small, kind of gritty, very urban congregation, very blue collar, and it was kind of struggling at that time, and so it was a good place to learn, and Stacy was a great boss to serve with, and so yeah, I mean, I kind of saw. Of course, in ordained ministry, kind of parish ministry is sort of the prototypical ministry that, for the most part, one expects to serve in, if one is clergy, if one is full-time clergy. And so it was a good place to learn. And interestingly, after Stacy and I left, that parish went through kind of a great revitalization process. I think Stacy and I had to um, sometimes you have to do some weeding so
Yeah.
that the next person can plant some seeds,
Yeah.
you plant seeds so the next person can kind of nurture it and things can grow. And I think that was what we did. I think we did a lot of weeding and seeding so that the next two rectors after that, or the next two priests in charge actually after that have done some amazing work, and that congregation is now thriving and full of young people, and it's really amazing.
So you left them a red carpet.
In some ways, yeah, we or at least got them to confront a lot of things that they needed to deal with, interpersonal conflict, and frankly, there were some personalities who would kind of create a lot of toxicity in that parish, and we had to sort of deal with that, and so that the next people, and frankly, some of the folks that we had challenges with had moved on by the time the next set of clergy came around, and so they were able to do some new things that we would not have been able to do, and COVID kind of accelerated that because I left. Of course, I left like 9 months before COVID hit. So I think that kind of accelerated some change that they needed to have happen.
Yeah,
Um,
you might have found yourself stuck if you had
yeah,
any longer. Yeah.
yeah. And so that the good part of curacy being a 2 year commitment. So I thought that I really wanted to stay in parish ministry and I had not conceived at all of leaving parish ministry. And I wound up, to my great surprise, so I knew, here's what I knew at that time, leaving that curacy in 2019. I knew that I was tired of cold weather in Ohio. I knew that I wanted to go south and get warm somewhere. I knew I wanted to be in a city, and I knew that I wanted to be near the water because I'm a Marylander. I love water. I love seafood, all that. And so I, looked. My dad had by that time retired and moved to South Florida.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was thinking about Florida, applied to a number of dioceses around Florida. And on a whim, I was like, well, Texas is by the water too. I think I was looking at a map, Google Maps or something.
Mhm.
And I was like, well, let's see what's going on in the Diocese of Texas. So I applied to I just kind of threw my resume out,
Mhm.
to a couple of positions, of a couple of parishes that were hiring for like an associate priest or something. And I remember in January of 2019, I got a call from the Reverend Francine Young, who was then the transitions officer in Diocese of Texas.
And who was the bishop then?
Andy Doyle.
Oh, good man.
Yeah, and he's been bishop there since 2007. I mean,
Good
so
man.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so anyway, Francine called me, and we didn't know each other. And she said, I've seen your resume in for a couple of positions here. I said, yeah. And I'll never forget this. She said, you're African American, right? And I said, yeah. She said, she is too. Okay, great. And then she said, I'm gonna be level with you. She said, some of the places that you applied to would not be a good place for you, and I didn't know that at the time because I didn't know anything about
Yeah,
Texas.
yeah, yeah.
Some of these places were in, counties where they're in another black person for miles, and certainly not another, black gay person.
Yeah.
And so, so I said, all right, please take me off the list, for those that wouldn't be a good spot. And she said, but this position just opened up as campus minister at the University of Houston. Do you think you'd be interested? And I was like, no, 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 I don't want to do campus ministry. I just hadn't conceived of it, didn't know anything about campus ministry. And I was only 29 at the time. So
Yeah.
I'm only a couple of years older than the college students, probably the same age as the graduate students.
Yeah.
So I kind of thought, how could I be their pastor, if I'm the same age, as them. And so but Francine and Jason Evans, who was the director of college ministry for the diocese at the time, kind of, I don't say talked me into it, but convinced me to at least, keep my name in and do an interview. And I did, and came down and did the in-person interview, and it was all fine enough. And then ultimately, I mean, it was sort of the thing that shook out, to my great surprise. And the last thing, when they offered it to me, and I hadn't expected to get it, and I sort of had a decision to make, and a few other things were still in process. A few other places I had my name in were still in process, and eventually the time came for a decision to have to be made. And uh, what I said was that because campus ministry didn't come with being part of it didn't come with a parish.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wasn't going to be tied to a parish. And I said, well, I'm a priest. Like, I want a place to, I'd like to at least have a place, at least once a month or so to, put on a chasuble, preach a sermon, and,
Mhm.
feel like, do what a priest does, right? And
Celebrate the Eucharist.
celebrate the Eucharist, yeah. And so Francine was also the rector at the time of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Houston, Black Parish, and
Yeah.
it happens to be the church right next to the college campuses I was going to be serving, of all places. And so, Francine she was like, oh yeah, look, he can preach and celebrate as much as he wants. She said, I'll
You
take
know,
him anytime.
I don't know if I have a lukewarm relationship to whether or not there are really coincidences.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Now we're coming up to the end of our time together. I want to ask what I think is an important question for you to ponder,
Mhm.
even if you don't want to answer it now. Um, do you have regrets? And if you do, are there any that you would admit to?
I go back and forth about that a lot. Because sometimes I think there are things that I would like to have done. And then I think, well, if I had done that thing and not the thing that I actually did, well then, I wouldn't have had the wonderful things happen to me that have, sometimes I think, oh well, maybe I should have gone through and done the MDiv JD program. But if I hadn't done that, if I had done that, wouldn't have gone and lived in Italy and, all those other things. Hadn't I met my husband Chris, in Houston. Sometimes I think, well, if I had, done this and not that, well, then I probably wouldn't have ended up in Houston and
Yeah,
would not
yeah.
have met Chris then. So, so there are always those things. Um, I try not to spend too much time on those things, but it also kind of makes me hold my thoughts a little bit lightly. I had in coming up to, I will say, I'm very happy to be the rector of Christ Church Shaker Heights. It has been an adjustment to living in the Cleveland area, but and it is certainly growing on us.
Yeah.
Uh, and there was just before, I think just after Chris and I landed here, there's a call that opened up in Guadalajara, Mexico, at the Episcopal Church there. And so Chris and I moved here like 3 months before the last election, right? 3 or 4 months before the last election. And sometimes, when things are especially rough in the news with this
And
administration
coals,
every
probably.
day. And cold here. And I mean, the first 3 months of being, that's not the first 3 months, January through March this year were just very, very difficult.
Yeah,
Lots of tax transition here.
yeah,
Weather was horrible.
yeah,
Now we're having a hard time purchasing our house, which we
yeah.
are now in. But some of the, as I was, walking this dog in the cold, I was like, God, we could have been in Mexico. Why did you put me here?
But as we approach the end here, I want to ask you a question that I ask everyone. Is there something that you wanted to talk about that I did not ask you?
Hmm.
And I would like to offer this opportunity to you to address it.
Yeah. The one thing I would say is that this it's interesting coming along as a priest and as a young priest at this time in the life of the church, particularly because and I was recently interviewed by the Religion News Service about this, that priests of my generation did not come along in the era when the church had any establishment power or prestige, well, or at least the extent to which we have any of that is so much less than it has been. We I didn't come along in the era of kind of where it was expected that you would get you would necessarily, get likely, spend your whole career as a full-time priest. Fewer and fewer churches are able to sustain, full-time clergy, especially, in one place, a lot more, multi-point, as they say, calls, where you're serving two or three or four churches than there are serving one. And so, it would be it would be easy, and I think a lot of times folks expect that I or other clergy of my generation kind of coming along in this era for the church, which I think is a lot harder than many other, times to come along in the church, would come at it from a sense of not quite depression, but of worry or concern for the life of the church. You read the statistics and they say, that, if the Episcopal Church continues at its current trajectory, there'll be no more Episcopalians by, 2060 or something like that. And I don't, um, I mean, I look at that. I don't think that way, of course. I am profoundly optimistic, profoundly hopeful, profoundly joyful about the church. I get to one of the best privileges of being a priest in this time is that I get to experience revitalization. One might even dare to say resurrection
Yeah, yeah, sure.
church every day.
Yeah.
Uh, and I get to be a part of the church being a place of love and care for LGBTQ folk who are in positions like where I was in college. And I mean, when I was in college ministry, I got to do that all the time. Got to talk to college students who were having experiences like what I experienced, and got to kind of breathe hope into them and speak hope into them. And here, I get to kind of see the church be a place of hope, of joy, of love for people. Uh,
Always.
and I mean, it is the greatest, most profound gift. And so I'm really joyful about the church. Uh,
Okay, let me ask you this question.
yeah,
And I speak to you in this way because I have been very critical of my own pastors.
yeah,
Um,
you're in good company.
no, no, no. We live in a very challenging time, perhaps the most challenging public policy time of my lifetime,
Hmm.
when the fundamentals of democracy
Hmm.
are significantly at risk.
Hmm.
I could hear some prophetic voice when you were at the National Cathedral.
Hmm.
What is your responsibility?
I sometimes remind people that Jesus didn't grow up in a democracy. Jesus grew up under King Herod.
Yeah.
The apostles didn't live in a democracy. They lived in the Roman Empire where, they were, when, most of the apostles died martyrs. Some, put on the cross like Jesus, fed to lions and burned alive and all sorts of terrible things because they were called to bear witness to their faith. Um, I I think one of the problems of the church having so recently been in this kind of establishment position is that we get a little bit too accustomed to that privilege. And I think now we're being reminded why the church is called to exist, what we're called to do. And so we're being challenged to live like Jesus in a new way, in a different way. For some that means showing up to protests or being more present to their legislators, maybe than in the past. To some, that means speaking hope and power and inspiration and strength to our people, to remind our people that we're not the church to live in a comfortable world. We're the church to afflict the comfortable as much as to comfort the afflicted, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's what the Holy Spirit does in us. And so I mean I think this is this is in some ways a sense of renewal for us. And I think part of the power in that is that it means that if we actually step up and step into how we're called to live and serve in Jesus, that it means that the people of the world around us, the people of our communities, will hopefully actually get to see us, get to see the church being the church um, in in a way that they've never seen us be.
Yes.
I'll leave you this kind of closing image. So I missed out on the Cleveland Pride Parade this year. Unfortunately, I was a little bit under the weather.
Yeah.
Uh, but my Bishop Ann Jolly is very she's always on Facebook and always posting videos and pictures on Facebook. And so she posted a video from the parade where the Episcopal Church, there were about 15 Episcopal churches that
Hmm.
were in the parade. I'm told that there were more Episcopal churches than any other than any other group of churches there. And each one brought their
That
banner.
does not surprise me. Go ahead.
Right, yeah. And so but each one brought their banner, and the announcer, as she announced each of the folks, each of the groups that was represented, read out their names from the banners. Christ Episcopal Church, Shaker Heights, Trinity Cathedral, Cleveland, St. Luke's Episcopal Church, Cleveland. After each one, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, Cleveland Heights, so on. Each one, this Episcopal church, that Episcopal church, that Episcopal church, that Episcopal church, that Episcopal church, each one, representing neighborhoods and communities all around the Cleveland area. And so I hope that what people heard who were standing around, who maybe have never heard of the Episcopal Church before, or never heard of a church, or never knew that there could, be such a thing as a supportive church for them, especially in this era, in this, era of anti-DEI,
Yes.
anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans, everything,
Yeah.
so much of which, coming from bad religion, frankly, that I hope that what they heard 15 times in a row was that the Episcopal Church is here for you, I mean, you can't miss it when they repeat it 15 times.
It's a welcome mat.
People heard it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So
so
that brings me a lot
so
of joy. Yeah.
I want to thank you
Yeah. It's a
for
pleasure.
being with us today. Now, what happens now is that this recording will be sent to a transcription service. And within just a few days, we'll have a transcript. There's a young man this semester who is my student assistant who will watch this and make sure that the written transcript, which is the official record,
Sure.
accurately reflects what we have talked about. Um, and if you desire, I will send that transcript to you um, to adjust in whatever way you want. Now, my own experience is that after you do this, whoever does this has no interest whatsoever in going through that transcript again. Um, but you should know that it will then the official record then become a part of the archives in perpetuity.
Wonderful. All right.
And for researchers. And Reverend Graves, let me say to you, as you were talking today, just a few seconds ago,
Mhm.
about the role of the church in resurrection,
Mhm.
I was filled with hope.
Good. Good.
And you know what? I am a crier, but I held back. But you have today brought me great faith and hope in how you see your role. And
Mhm.
you are a very young man. And the only thing I would ask, and I don't think I really have to remind you of this, is that take off the blinders, make room for serendipity,
Mhm.
as you have always done.
Well, thank you.
You have a brilliant future ahead of you, and the church is greatly blessed
Thank you so much. This
to
has been
have you in
so
a
cool.
leadership position.
Yeah, this is a joy, I mean, I said this to my people. Yes, I was grateful that we had in the reading. Suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us because the Holy Spirit's continually poured into us. That is so true now. We're in a time of suffering, and so many of our communities are in a time of suffering, and that continues to produce endurance and character in us, and the hope of Jesus Christ, and the hope in the faith of through the power of the Holy Spirit continues to spring eternal, and does for me, and I hope it does for all of us in the church. That's why we're in this business of the church, and it's what we're called to
Yes.
carry forth to others. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
What a
Thank
joy.
you. Thank you.
Blessings.
Take
God bless.
care.